And I think that we have to start this symposium with Robert King. Bob King, I know him from the beginning. When I came to Yale, I met Bob. He was very, very present in many moments, and he was for me a wonderful teacher, and because we have too many common interests in this field. And I think Bob King can, introduce to all of us the story of Donald.
Well, I wanted to start out by thanking Ernesto and his colleagues not only for all their wonderful hospitality in general here at this meeting, but also for organizing this session. It's been a wonderful experience being here with so many friends from so many countries and epochs of one's own life. Other colleagues are going to be talking about Donald's contributions to research, to trauma, to mentorship, but I want to give kind of a general introduction to Donald and his vision of the interpersonal and social embeddedness of our field and of human development, because I think that's the matrix in which it's all best understood. If one's been around psychology or psychiatry or even philosophy for long enough, one notices that over the last half century there's really been a tremendous paradigm shift from kind of a single person paradigm to a much more interpersonal, intersubjective, and socially embedded view of human relationships and of psychopathology. And this is a shift that Donald was very much involved in and shared in. When one looked at classical psychoanalytic drive theory or classical behavioral theory, it was kind of the infant sort of existed in sort of a Cartesian solipsism and only accidentally sort of stumbled into the world of social relatedness. And in contrast, Donald shared a much more Wittgensteinian view of the notion that it was our involvement with others that shaped who we are in the most intimate sorts of ways right from the very first. And that mammalian infants were hardwired from the very first to perceive and interact and to seek proximity and interaction with others. And this is apparent even in some of the latest neurophysiological sort of work on motor neurons, that if you look at monkeys, you can see that there are specific cells in the premotor cortex that not only register when we ourselves perform an intentional act like picking up something and putting it in our mouth, but registers when we see other people doing the same thing, and that this isn't just a reaction to the motor movement or to the motor morphology of what's happening, but that we're actually hardwired to discern intentions and perspectives in other people. And this was a view that I think would have been deeply congenial to Donald. And it's in a similar sort of way, language, well, let me just show you, this shows you some of the same studies that have been done to really dissect this in a wonderful sort of experimental sort of way that Donald would very much have appreciated, because he was very much shaped by his interest in Wittgenstein, who had the notion that that language wasn't something that we accidentally stumbled onto the way Skinner would have described, but that really our whole language takes its meaning from our involvement in a community of shared verbal meanings and interactions and shared forms of life with others. And so as a result, Donald's favorite quote from Wittgenstein was, "The best picture of the human soul is the human body." That is, that soul and body, as Colette Chaland was talking just before this, were not sort of separate entities, but represented two facets of our social existence. Donald wrote some about how Donald himself was an intensely social person, and he wrote some about how he came by his interests in social phenomena. He said, "My preoccupation as an observer of relationships, an early sign of what's become a persistent scientific curiosity, was shaped by my broad and buoyant ethnic family, which provided substantial raw material. We were a close-knit family with grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, our household constantly filled with guests, friends, and families for meals and holidays. A quiet participant observer like me had multiple opportunities for trying to figure out who was related to whom, which people cared for the others, and I might add parenthetically, and which ones did not, what aunt or uncle or cousin was odd but yet part of the group. This interest in human relationships filled my imagination about how children are born into families, how parents love their children, how children express their needs and grow up, and how families change in the course of generations of birth, maturation, marriage, and old age. To study the happiness as well as the grief of family life became a favorite intellectual hobby and later developed into a deep interest in history, and particularly social history." So not only did Donald share Wittgenstein's notion that our whole sense of meaning and motivation were shaped by our involvement with communities, but that this wasn't simply an intellectual and cognitive matter, that it had important affective bonds as well. As Donald wrote, "The affectionate substrate of social salience that forms the preconditions for becoming interested in others. What fascinated me most was how intimate relationships and the desire for being with the other precedes the rest of cognitive development, and that this social motivation moves these other achievements forward, including meta-representations and theories about other minds." I've referred to Donald's account about how his early family experience shaped his interest in people, but let me trace a little of his subsequent intellectual and scientific development. At college at Brandeis, where he met Phyllis, Donald had many intellectual passions. He struggled with Descartes and Descartes' attempt to account for the relationship of body and mind. He also discovered the works of Martin Buber that had a tremendous impact on him in terms of what was entailed in an authentic I-thou encounter. And Donald wasn't just a solitary learner sitting in the library. For him, learning was a form of dialogue and interpersonal engagement. If anybody here had the experience of discussing things with Donald, one would know that these were arguments that went on far into the night at the Hayes Bickford Cafe. In the course of the several hours, Donald might argue passionately both sides of the same argument. Donald had the uncanny ability to seek out and find mentors, and he had a tremendous diversity of them, each in the flower of their own scientific maturity, and he used this to master fields that were still in their formative stages, whether it was neurobiology, behavioral psychology, social policy, and the like. And this, I think, as Andreas will be talking, this wasn't just good luck. Donald had an immense capacity to really engage people intensely and to challenge them and to learn from them. For example, when Donald was still an undergraduate at Brandeis, one important figure for him was Ogden Lindsley, an early experimental psychologist whose specialty was operant conditioning. And Donald would recount how they would stay up late at night at the Metropolitan State Hospital designing experiments. And this led, within a year or two, to Donald's first published paper while he was still an undergraduate. Justin and his peers. This was accepted right off the bat by Child Development in '62 without any revisions, which, as Donald said, set a bad model for later experience. And this was an operant conditioning study of a 13-year-old boy and a peer in an adjacent booth. And what Donald was able to do was to show the distinctive patterns of competition and cooperation that the boy would develop with his different partners, and how these varied under different experimental conditions. And what Donald loved about this paradigm was that you could have objective, analyzable data that could demonstrate the impact of experimental variables for studying forms of social interaction and parameters that the individual participants themselves weren't even aware of. Another early mentor was Peter Wolf, who studied infant development at Boston Children's Hospital. And here Donald designed an experimental instrument, the suckometer, which you can sort of see up there. It's a pacifier which would actually record the rates of the child sucking, and you could sort of study how the child comforted, would stop crying, how soon he would start crying again after you removed the synthetic nipple. And again, it wasn't even the specific results, but the commitment to developing strategies of combining empirical observational techniques with controlled experimental manipulation of variables that so intrigued Donald. After a year at Cambridge in philosophy, Donald began medical school at Yale, and there at the Child Study Center and at Yale in general, in addition to the rich psychoanalytic atmosphere under Al Solnit, Donald found a well-established tradition of empirical studies of infant and child development. Arnold Gesell, who founded the Child Study Center back in 1911, was really the first person to systematically study patterns of child development. And this is a very high-tech piece of equipment circa 1920s, which was a observation dome which you could use for filming infants and their development. And Gesell developed a whole series of carefully, meticulously recorded films of infants' development in motor and sensory and linguistic and language, and published this in 1930 for the Atlas of Infant Behaviors. And when we use the phrase now somebody's going through a stage, that actually goes back to Arnold Gesell. In addition to the Gesellian tradition, Donald met Danny Friedman, who was then a young faculty member. Danny had made what's probably the most enduring observation in all of biological child psychiatry, which is the serotonergic abnormalities in the platelets of autistic individuals and their family members. And Donald became close to Danny and began to utilize some of the neurobiological techniques that Danny had developed and applying them systematically for the first time to child psychiatry. After a brief stint at the White House and NIH doing child policy and research, Donald came back to Yale again and really began to apply some of these things. Here is Donald and the molecule of clonidine, and this was really the first rational psychopharmacological application of neurochemical principles to the treatment of childhood disorders, the use of clonidine for Tourette's. In addition, Donald continued his interest in child policy and psychoanalysis. Here's Donald and Phyllis and the kids with Anna Freud and Dorothy Burlingham. And Donald chose for his special interest two disorders that really involved the most fundamental derangement of our humanity on a neurobiological basis. The first was autism, where the individual seemed to have a defect in the usual innate capacity to see other people as agents of feelings and motives and perspectives like our own, a condition that one person has referred to as mind blindness. And this deeply interests Donald. The other condition, which Jim Leckman alluded to earlier, is Tourette syndrome, which calls into question our most basic assumptions that somehow we are the authors of our own thoughts and intentions and actions, where these unfortunate children are bombarded by the urge to perform acts that are both, that they feel to be both them and at the same time not them. And as Donald remarked, studying autism and Tourette's taught him far more about the concept of intention and theory of mind than the career in philosophy at Cambridge, which he had contemplated, ever could have. At the same time, Donald, as I said, was an intensely social person, so he didn't study these disorders alone. He assembled a whole team of like-minded investigators. This is just Leo Kanner for standing in for autism, and of course Gilles de la Tourette. But Donald assembled a team of like-minded scientists. This was in an earlier and more hirsute phase of child psychiatry. You'll recognize on the left not only Al Solnit, but Jerry Young, Donald, and the then young Jim Leckman on the right. And Donald was able to put together teams of collaborators to come at these complicated disorders in a variety of ways. For Donald, science was a verb and not a noun, and most of us who worked with Donald would have the experience that after discussing various interesting developments in literature, politics, or philosophy, Donald would say, "Okay, team, let's do some science." And we would then sort of settle down, and for the next 2 or 3 hours, or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 hours, would be brainstorming and planning research. So as Donald's own career flourished, one of his proudest accomplishments was to bring in a succession of young investigators not only from around the country but from around the world, and to help them develop research skills and competencies which they could then bring back to their own countries, in which the Cone Fellowship embodies today. Donald realized that building a department, once he became chair himself in '82, was more than just building bricks and mortar, although he was wonderful at that. He saw that it was the task of faculty to help young investigators through the phases of their career, and that it required an institutional milieu that shared many of the aspects of family life with all of its complexities. How to help young investigators negotiate the tasks of separation and individuation, how to manage sibling rivalries, coping with Oedipal resentments and competition, and finally helping aging faculty members make the timely relinquishment of power and opportunity to younger colleagues as well. And he would have been very proud to have seen all of the young talent assembled here today. In later years, as Donald's scope grew even broader, he became president of Yucca and became very interested in questions of trauma that we'll be hearing more about. But he came to be close to Ernesto and Helmut and Philip Jamet and Colette Chaland and a whole host of other international colleagues with whom he remained very close over the years. In the aftermath of the First Gulf War, he became very interested in trauma, both domestic in the streets of our cities as well as internationally. And part of Donald's vision for Yucca was that the concern for the world's children was the one great force for peace that we all shared, that regardless of politics, all parents wanted their children to grow up healthy and secure, and that we could all find common cause in that endeavor. And this was a deep belief of Donald's. He even helped to organize the first Eastern Mediterranean Child Mental Health Conference that brought together people from all over the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean, and this continues to this day. After Donald died, we realized that his voice, which was so vivid to those of us who knew him, would be known to future generations only through his many papers, which were scattered over 4 decades through scores of different journals. And so under Andreas's leadership, and with the help of the Yale Press, we decided to pull together a collection of Donald's most important papers, which was published last year under this title, Life is with Others. The title is a reference to a classic work on the shtetls and small villages of Eastern Europe from which Donald's grandparents came, and to its intense nexus of interpersonal relationships and deep interpersonal involvements. And we chose that title because we felt that it captures Donald's own style of doing science as well as how he conceptualized human development. I'd like to close with a quote of Donald's from his Sterling lecture. He was speaking about Franz Rosenzweig's book, The Star of Redemption, which he counted together with Buber and Wittgenstein as one of the books that influenced him the most. And Donald wrote as follows. That he gave this talk at a time when he was already gravely ill. Rosenzweig writes, Donald said, that the beginning of philosophy is the fear of death. I no longer feel Rosenzweig was quite right. I fear he has given too much undeserved credit to Thanatos, to death. I have learned from our research and clinical work and in my own bones that philosophy can be fed from a sweeter well, a more caring source, from Eros and its earthly representative, our first and continually replenished capacities for loving. From this point of regard, death seems predestined, dull, and not a surprise. The great surprise is birth, being, and the improbability of lives such as ours, suffused with friendship, communication, and the shared pursuit of knowledge, wherever it may lead. May his memory be for a blessing.